A draft of the proposed amendments to the Representation of the People Act, Guyana's main electoral law, has been published online ahead of the government's plan to table them before the end of the year. Multi-million-dollar fines and hefty jail times from 5 to 10 years are among the proposed amendments. The current Irfan Ali-led government promised to reform the law to ensure that what happened in the 2020 elections never happens again and to ensure those who attempt fraud are dealt with. The High Court had found that Claremont Mingo, the returning officer who controlled the March 2, 2020 election process in Region 4, had breached the law when he failed to follow the lawful procedure to arrive at the correct vote count in the region. His calculations, which were later presented by the Chief Elections Officer, Keith Lowenfield, to the Guyana Elections Commission GECOM for declaration, would have allowed clear fraud and provided for the installation of a government that had not won the elections. Even after a national recount had clearly shown the PPP had won the elections, the Chief Elections Officer presented Mingo's botched figures until a Court of Appeal decision forced him to present the figures from the recount. This allowed for the PPP government to be sworn in after a 5-month delay. Some of the key amendments are: number 1, a presiding officer, that is the person who manages the voting and counting process at the polling place, to be charged and liable on summary conviction to a fine of $5 million and to imprisonment for 10 years if he or she fails to provide materials to agents of political parties. Secondly, at the opening of polls, the presiding officer should give each polling agent a copy of the official list of electors or part of the list with the names of those who are entitled to vote there and their registration records. Thirdly, a presiding officer or anyone who allows someone to vote when they are not eligible could be found guilty of an offense and be liable on summary conviction to a fine of $10 million and to imprisonment for 10 years. Eligibility to vote is checked against several things, including the person's identity and their fingers, to ensure that there is no ink to suggest they voted before. Fourthly, the use of a tendered ballot, that is, of a different color than the ordinary ballot paper, could be used to allow someone to vote when that person's name has been marked off of the list, but the presiding officer determines that the person has not voted and that a mistake has been made. This differently colored ballot paper would be placed in a separate packet other than the ballot box for counting later. Additionally, a person could become guilty of an offense if instead of issuing a tendered ballot to the voter, they issue an ordinary ballot or vice versa. A person who commits this offense, it is proposed, would be liable on summary conviction to a fine of $10 million. It is also proposed that explicit mention be made of a valid passport as a prescribed identity paper for voting, and that a presiding officer who refuses to accept it or any other prescribed form of identification could be guilty of an offense and liable on summary conviction to a fine of $5 million and to imprisonment for 10 years. Anyone who causes obstruction at a polling place could also be liable to a fine of $5 million and jail time of 3 years. The presiding officer could also be fined $10 million and be imprisoned for 10 years if he or she fails to allow those who are entitled to be there to verify or ascertain every count, to examine every ballot and information recorded, and to make objections or ask questions where necessary. Importantly, it is proposed that the definition of an election officer should be expanded to add 2 other persons, namely a supernumerary returning officer and a deputy supernumerary returning officer. These officers will rank 3rd and 4th in line, just behind the chief election officer, his deputy, and the returning officer. And the role of these new election officers is intended to support the integrity of the election process and serve as a backup or alternative to the returning officer or deputy returning officer. Regarding Electoral District 4, the proposal is to divide the district into 4 sub-districts distinguished by the names 1. East Bank Demerara Sub-District, 2. North Georgetown Sub-District, 3. South Georgetown Sub-District, and 4. East Bank Demerara Sub-District. For each sub-district, the proposal is for there to be a supernumerary returning officer and an election clerk. Reporting for the newsroom, I am Vishani Raghuveer.